Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the iDive. This podcast bridges the knowledge gap between students and industry professionals by engaging in meaningful conversations. Our goal comes from helping students seeking to learn more about how they would go about making the transition to postgrad as seamless as possible. Today, we have David Wilson, a 2015 MI alumni from the Information Systems and Design concentration at the Faculty of Information. With over 6 years of experience working with the University Health Network in digital operations, research, and now nearing 7 years working with Wolters Kluwer Canada as manager of content standards, he brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to share with the team. We thank you kindly for your support and time in helping students learn from your stories and reflections. This episode 3 features information systems and design. Let's give a warm welcome to David, and why don't you start off by giving a brief introduction about yourself and your story on how you got into ISD.
Sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. So my story starts in, 2010 approximately, or 2011. So I was working at the University Health Network in the education department. It was an education and research department. And in that area, to progress, I realized that I needed to further my education. So there was a limit within that sort of space as to how far you could go without any sort of graduate work. So I started investigating what I was interested in. And I really liked UX design, information systems. I was really getting into search at the time, actually, because we had just done a huge upgrade to our search for our library and for other patient resources. And so I stumbled across the iSchool and the KMDI program, and I was fairly interested in that. And so, I went to the information session, gathered a little bit more. And at the time, it had a good program because it was part-time available for me, so I could finish it up in about 4 years. And so I did part-time my whole time. And that was really sort of the thing that drew me the most, because I needed to be able to balance my work life with my school life, because I wasn't going to be able to take a full 2 years off, just given the reality of my life at the time. So that's what made me go to the school, and I had a great time.
That's really interesting. I actually didn't know that you did the program part-time. Could you tell me more about your own experiences on what information systems and design is like for someone trying to explore the field after you learned what it was throughout that experience?
Sure. So at the time when I was working with the UHN, in the education department, we were the educational informatics group, actually. And so we were tasked with developing information systems every day, really is what we did. And so at the time, I sort of haphazardly learned on the job what goes into developing requirements for systems and how systems work, being able to read diagrams of how systems work. But the iSchool actually has a couple of practical programs. I don't know if they're still offered. I think it was 1341 and 1342 at the time, that really help you learn how to do, diagramming of information systems, and also coming up with requirements. And it really helped me understand. And what it does is it gives you a basis, right? So you're never going to get a perfect world scenario from school that you're able to just kind of say, this is what real life is, right? But it gives you the tools and a foundation to say, oh yeah, no, this is a requirements gathering session. Maybe I need to, examine the information flow, and maybe I need to do, some sort of workflow analysis or something like that, or data flow diagram to figure out exactly who's doing what, when, what happens to information. And nowadays, it's extremely common for me to be looking over diagrams and workflows and doing all the stuff that we talk about in the class. And yeah, that's what we do every day now.
I love how you phrase that as that school is a knowledge foundation, and it's not necessarily going to give you exactly what you need to emulate industry. That is really great to hear from someone who's out there in the industry, knowing that everything I learn now in school isn't something that I'm going to have to just take out there and be my formal training. So thank you for that. Could you tell me a little bit more about what kind of work you're responsible for in your current role?
Sure. So Wolters Kluwer is it considered itself a publishing company for a long time, because in Canada, it used to be known as CCH. And so they provide educational resources to business professionals, so lawyers, doctors, accountants, what have you. And so I work within tax and law in Canada. And Wolters Kluwer is a large European company that eventually bought CCH. And so what I do day in and day out is figure out exactly how we get the content that writers write to customers. And so we're always trying to find what is the best way to give that content to our customers. So we're currently building out new systems, new research platforms, as we call them. And so what we're trying to do is, how do you take what is, in some cases, 100 years worth of content? Like we have case law for lawyers that goes back 100 years. We have cases actually before Canada was even formed. It goes back to the British courts. And so you think about like, well, first, how does that actually turn into information digitally? And then how do you display it and make it user-friendly for a customer? And so my job is to work with what we call a product manager. They're kind of like a mini CEO. And so their job is to be responsible for one product. And they define, exactly what they want the customer experience to be like. And then I'm responsible for figuring out how we're going to deliver that content to the system using the systems that we have, and whether or not we need to, build some new tools, or maybe we just need to modify existing ones, or sometimes it's, get rid of tools and it's a scripting sort of thing that you do. So we get developers to do that. So that's my job right now. And keeps me busy.
Good to know. Just based on that explanation of what you do right now, what are some other possible positions that are best suited for ISD graduates?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot during the Ask an Alum. And so from my point of view, for ISD students, you're going to be looking in the world of business analysts, system analysts, that sort of thing, solution architects. And there tends to be a hierarchy, right? So in the business analyst world, you're going to want to be able to understand what people are telling you and what they want. And what is possible with the system, because there's a lot of systems out there and we think they work magic, but there's somebody figuring out how that's actually going to happen. And ISD students are perfectly situated for that, right? They need to understand and plot out, what are the screens that somebody's going to see at what point, what actions are there. And it works hand in hand with, information architecture. It works hand in hand with knowledge media design, all those things, right? And you're going to need to be able to articulate it. And those positions exist in every industry that's out there because everybody's having to do digital work, right? So banks are always looking for them, government's looking for them. Sometimes they might not be called business analysts. Sometimes they're called system analysts. Those tend to be a little bit more technical. Those people tend to have more skills with databases and systems and a development background, but I don't think ISD students should shy away from it personally if you feel like that's in your wheelhouse. And then, as you work through that, I know at UHN and both at Wolters Kluwer, sort of the progress up there is to become sort of an architect, where you're the one plotting out, how are all these different systems going to work together. And that can get extremely challenging, but also extremely rewarding for somebody who likes that kind of challenge.
Awesome. It sounds like you're coming from a place of seeing wide breadth in that industry, in that space. So thank you so much for sharing that. A question one of our students asks, or what kind of average industry salary should they look for in these different types of roles when it comes to industry?
Yeah, I get that one too. So, a business analyst position, especially an entry one, it's going to be the 40 to 50 range. But as you work your way up, become specialized in analyst, if you're brought in out to become maybe a project manager, you could easily be getting close to six figures. I won't say how many, like it really depends. And the architect's positions too tend to be extremely well paid, over 100,000 in most cases. But you do need to work your way through that, right? You're not getting that money right away. It is going through the process and putting in your time and that sort of thing. But I've known very successful project managers who make a very good living. And also, if you're a very good project manager, there's no shortage of contract work too. I've met many who've decided to go into their own, out onto their own and be contract workers and do extremely well that way too.
Okay, well, reflecting on that process and starting from that initial journey, then making it to that end stage or transitionary stage, how can you reflect on your own interview experiences on the get-go? What questions should students expect in their interviews?
Yes. So as somebody who has been in both positions, somebody who's interviewed for a job and also has people interview for him, don't embellish or lie, speak truth. I know that seems obvious, but you'd be surprised once a couple questions start to prod how quickly somebody's story can fall apart. So just be honest. Don't say you can do something if you can't. Doesn't mean that you're not willing to learn, of course, right? Like that's the attitude I think that everybody's looking for. Because a lot of skills you're going to train. one of the things that I was talking to one of my staff recently about was you start to develop base skills that are out there, right? So it might be learning to manage a project, or it might be understanding how databases work. But once you get into a specific job, they're going to have totally different systems. For example, I have a buddy who's a business analyst, and he worked with a company who had been using the same PDF software for something like 20 years because they had embedded so much of their workflow process into this one specific version of PDF of Adobe Acrobat that they couldn't develop because what they used there no longer worked. So when you're in a new job and when you're going for something, you need to highlight your base skills and how they can adapt. But the reality is you're going to be learning so much about what happens at that new job that to say, you know, I've got the exact skill that would transfer, well, you might have the base skills, but then what you're developing over time is the institutional knowledge. And so if you bring an approach in your interviews that you're eager to learn, you have the understanding, you know, you have the base skills, you might have had a couple projects that had some similar processes, right? But you're not going to be able to say, I'm going to go in there tomorrow and, you know, fix every problem you got or anything like that, right? It's a process and you learn as you go. So I hope that helps.
So what I'm hearing is always having this attitude of lifelong learning and being really open to new experiences and learning things on the go.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, to build on that, one of the questions I get a lot from the students in the iSchool, you know, what do I like or something like that. And it's very similar. It's, you know, the mentality of if you leave yourself open to it, you know, you get out of it what you put into it, right? And so if you're willing to listen and to learn, people are willing to teach and do that. And so the ability to grow is an extremely, at least for myself, important aspect when I'm hiring somebody and who's coming in for an interview.
Awesome. Love to hear it. For the next question I have, just kind of building on that learning narrative, what are some fundamental skills or software that you must know in the ISD field, or could someone start to learn right now, those hard skills before getting to that interview?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of the base skills, you know, don't get caught up on technology like databases and, you know, I have to learn how to program in Python or something like that. For an ISD person, I think the most important thing you can do is be able to document what somebody has said into a requirement that a developer can read. Because there is a huge gap oftentimes, not to say the developers don't understand what customers want and what people are being asked for, but oftentimes they're not in the room. So your job in a lot of cases, an ISD person, is understanding what are going to be the steps necessary to recreate that. And so if I were to recommend some basic tools, I think, you know, absolutely the word processing tools of the world are really important. Learn also how to represent your stuff, understand when you need a table versus a document. You know, a lot of people don't want to read 30 pages of documentation. You might have an assignment that requires you to put in 4,000 words, but, you know, when it comes to somebody reading requirements, they might only want a table with a handful of things. So it's being able to summarize information also is really important. Excel is a great tool for when you're building like mini databases, when you need to filter stuff and be able to, you know, quickly generate stats and that kind of stuff. Those are very helpful. You're often going to be doing that in all sorts of roles in ISD. You know, you might be in charge of doing metrics for a company or something like that. So Excel is the standard one for that. It's amazing how much Excel runs the world and business world. Office and Gmail are great. Nowadays, if you can learn Slack and Teams, that is extremely helpful in this current modern world. Being able to do things through video and chat is extremely important. And both of those tools are great. And then if you want to go more on the technical set and the mindset, any of the database stuff, MySQL or MS SQL, both are good. Some sort of SQL language. And then from there, it would depend. If you really want to be more of a developer, a true developer, I don't really know what to recommend because that's not really my area. And if you want to go more again into diagrams and workflows and that sort of thing, then Visio is a great tool. The other thing, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, if you're going to go into an environment that works in what we call an agile framework, chances are you're going to want to familiarize yourself with some project management software. I know Jira was both popular where I worked at PMH and now where I am at Wolters Kluwer. That's one example. We use other tools, Trello, but something that helps you create a project and manage it. There's a lot of them out there. They tend to do similar things. How they might do it might differ, but understanding, you open a task, you track time, it filters up to some sort of larger story or epic, or it depends on what the software calls it, project or something like that. MS Projects is good too, but I find it tends to be more in the realm of traditional waterfall stuff. They tried to go into the agile stuff, but it's not as common. And I find that you tend to see Jira and some other project management software. So familiarize with something like that too.
Okay. Wow, that is a huge toolkit that I got to look up on LinkedIn Learning after this conversation. Thank you for that. Just kind of speaking of those projects, what's one of your favorite projects? And could you describe the key skills you found useful for them?
That's a great question. Thank you. So probably the project that I was the proudest of was when I was still at PMH. Well, there were two, but they were connected. So it was the redesign of the whole Princess Margaret website. So at the time, about 10 years ago now or something like that, it was a site that really had like 6 pages, and they were all sort of like, directory type sites, or like a marketing about us type site. There's very little patient friendly information. It didn't help us. And so I joined that project originally as basically a business analyst, and somebody who helped, develop the RFP and that sort of thing. But I worked with an extremely good project manager who I look up to a lot. And she eventually left, and she thought that, I had developed into a sufficient enough position that I could take it over. And so we prioritized that project over to me. And in the end, I was responsible for getting, thousands of pages of content out the door. We had to come up with processes. We're managing, 3 teams, different locations. It's probably the biggest thing I had done at the time. And it was a lot of fun. I learned a ton. I developed a lot of confidence out of that, and it was really good. And one of the associated projects with that was the updating of a library system for our Princess Margaret. Well, it was all the UHN libraries at the time, and putting that online. That was also something that hadn't been done before. It was previously like an internet-only tool, and we exposed it to the internet. So it exposed me to teams of people that I'd never met before, because we needed to figure out how to, securely expose, a system within healthcare that met all of the requirements by security and privacy. And at the time, it still is a very big deal, but it was just coming into its, its prime at that point. We were just really starting to reflect on that. And so we were going through new processes, and it was extremely challenging, but challenging is what's fun.
So I guess then there was some skills you learned in that process and that project that may not necessarily have been, what did I say, like relevant to ISD from the get-go, and you just kind of learned them on the go. Is there any aspects of ISD, maybe learning how to code or the security skills that you were just mentioning, that people may not think is integral?
So one of the things I like to tell the students who ask me about this stuff is that I use the stuff I learned from the iSchool every single day in my job. And so, starting and writing an RFP, I had no idea what that was. I don't know if they still do it, but we did that in one of the requirements classes. And by the time I was done learning those schools, they were kind of happening in tandem. And I can write an RFP, my eyes closed now. But it gives you the framework to understand what it is, right? Whereas I gained more of the practical skills when I was at the hospital. And it also had its own process. I've done RFPs since at my new job, and it's very different, right? Because the requirements are different. So you understand, again, going back, like institutional knowledge, like this is what's required for an RFP at a healthcare versus, an RFP or something like that at a private business. So I was using those skills every day. And then project management, I did the project management course. I suspect it's still offered because it's an extremely valuable skill set. And, eventually I had to do that stuff when I took that over. And so I was using those same skills. A lot was built on the job, because again, you learn what works and what doesn't work. But I also learned a lot of the fundamentals at school. So yeah, I think every day, but it was more of the, this might get me in trouble, but the softer skills. It wasn't like I was coding, you know what I mean? Like there were a couple times where I had to go into some HTML and figure out double escapes because of whatever, but that was rare. 99% of my time I'm on the phone or dealing with emails or reading and reviewing documents.
Okay, good to know. Well, then my next question is something to do with ISD. Is there any myths about the industry that you want to debunk?
Is there any myths? It isn't magic, and you can't do everything. There's a joke in project management where it's like scope, time, resources, pick two. You can't get all three, and that's a reality, right? And in ISD, and in a lot of technology, oftentimes people are like, well, why did they do this? They must know. Yeah, we do know. We know. We were probably the first ones to know. But the reality was there was something in the systems that existed, something within the time frame that we had, something within the money that we had that we just couldn't do it. But we would love to do it. And so oftentimes I hear people like, well, why would they design it like this? Well, there's probably a very good reason. There's always a reason at the time. And so that would be the thing I would say, that, you're not going to go, and a lot of systems, not everything's going to be like Google and customer facing products. When you get inside a business, oftentimes the systems that you're working with are ugly and are unuser friendly, because we as businesses tend to prioritize what the customer sees. And so oftentimes the internal stuff, it's, can you use it? Yeah. Okay. Well, then it's good enough. Like, what? I'm sorry. And you'll learn that in your usability classes that usefulness is 4 times more important than usability, right? And so people need to understand that that's the value, and they see the value, and so they use the tool. So there you go.
Interesting. I did not even think of it that way. If you're on the back end of things and you're the employee, you're going to be working on that framework that's not customer facing. So it's interesting to see it from that perspective as well. Could you tell me a little bit about opportunities for growth in an ISD career? I know you mentioned this a little earlier on, but would you describe it as more horizontal or vertical?
Yeah, it depends ultimately what you want to get out of it. The vertical growth is going to be within going between levels of analysts. You can usually jump, going like the horizontal shifts is a little less common, unless you consider an analyst equivalent to a project manager or a product manager. But I tend to actually see those as a bit of a step up, because you tend to have a little bit different responsibilities. So those tend to be, I think, the verticals. And then usually within most organizations, there's different tiers of business analysts. So it might be a 1, 2, 3 or 3, 2, 1 or whatever, depends on how they say it, or senior versus a junior. So those tend to be the more vertical, but those tend to be more about pay, compensation, and maybe, you get more, more specific cases or clients at that level. It's less about responsibilities. But that depends, I guess, where you are. But that's sort of what I would say about ISD. And in development world, it's often the same, where you tend to be maybe growing within a specific developer tier, but you're not going to a higher level exactly, unless you go into management. But it's a different ball game.
Interesting. So is there something you know now about this aspect of your career that you wish you knew about earlier?
What I wish I had learned before going in was that the philosophy and the frameworks were going to be just as important as the practical. And so I went into this, and I can tell you, I remember doing whatever that systems course is. 1342, I think it is. That's what's saying in my mind, but it's probably 1341. I remember you had to chart out a system, and we were developing a new system, an internal system, to help with our publishers getting PDFs into a certain directory and then published online. And, we were working with a very specific software solution at the time. And so I went into that class thinking it has to be this software that does it. And so I was, a strong personality. So I, bullied my group into saying it has to be this software that we use in our group project. And at the time, one of the TAs was just like, well, why? Why don't you make it, just generic? come up with the framework and then find the best software that suits. And that was 100% the right answer. Because he's right, you're limiting yourself when you do that. Now, in some cases, the reality is you're going to have to do that. But other times, you want to start with sort of what you ultimately want. And so that comes down again to the fundamentals. And that comes back to the stuff that you might not see as immediately applicable because, no, I have the software. Why can't you just tell me how to do it with SharePoint or with Excel or with Jira, right? Because that's not what's important. What's important is understanding what you ultimately need to do and then go and find out the right solution. And oftentimes, you will find that, oh, maybe that was the right solution. And other times you won't. And so it's really important to stay open to the goals and more like the philosophy than some of the practicals.
Okay. Just kind of building on these reflections. Imagine it's your first day back at the iSchool. If you could have a conversation with yourself and give yourself one piece of advice going back to where you started, what would it be?
Try to eat before you go to class because the Subway that's in the library is not very good. So there's like a good burger place 2 streets over. Go there first and then go to class. You will be hungry.
They actually replaced that Subway with the burrito.
Oh.
Now that's much better. So I'll let you know that. But thank you. That's a good piece of advice. We are just about to wrap up. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm going to kind of end off with a fun rapid fire session, if that's okay, and give you a couple of prompts and then ask you to tell me what runs through your mind.
Sure.
Okay. So ready? Learning is?
The meaning of life.
Innovation is?
Doing something new.
What is something people often get wrong about you?
How to spell my last name.
What is one piece of advice that's so awful you need to warn us against it?
Yeah, if you find a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. That's not true. I love doing my job and it's work. It's
Good to know. What is one thing you're really excited about?
Watching my daughter grow up.
Mm-hmm. And what is one thing you're most grateful for?
Being able to work remotely for the past year.
Interesting. And what is your biggest pet peeve?
People who talk at the movie theaters, maybe.
Okay. If you could describe yourself in one word, what would it be?
Tall.
Okay. What is a song you can't live without?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm trying to think. It's going to be some Beatles song, probably. So pick your favorite Beatles song. I agree.
Okay, good to know. Well, that just about wraps up our session for today. I wanted to thank you so much for your insights, and I'm sure many students, including myself, will find real value in the knowledge you shared here today. We are so grateful for your time, and we hope to have you back one day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.